So this morning, it's gate 51 as we move through the 108 gates of Dharma illumination. And today's gate statement says, realization of non-appearance is a gate of Dharma illumination, for with it we experience the truth of cessation. So this realization of non-appearance is a very old teaching in the Buddhist tradition. The Sanskrit word is Anutpatika Dharmaksanti. So this is recognition and acceptance that nothing actually arises or perishes, or another way to say that might be all conditioned phenomena are empty. So there is nothing that we can distinguish as arising and perishing. So in later text, we encountered this teaching, or we encountered this as teachings about life and death, or birth and death, or arising and perishing, or coming and going, or appearing and disappearing. All of these things are pointing to this teaching. So it shows up in early texts like the Yogacara Bhumi Sastra, which is a huge depiction of the stages of the Yogacara path to Buddhahood. And according to this text, this recognition of non-appearance is realized by bodhisattvas at the 8th stage of their development. So this goes a long way back. There's a Japanese word for this, but it's pointing all the way back to a very old teaching with a Sanskrit term. So Nagarjuna also talks about this in the Mahaprajna Pradamita Shastra. In that text, somebody asks how a bodhisattva can possibly consider all beings to be equal when they are so obviously different. I mean, we look at this group, we're all very different. So how does the bodhisattva consider all beings to be equal? This person who was asking says, after all, beings can be very different. A cow has cow nature and a horse has horse nature, and those two things can't be switched, right? The same is true for good people and evil people. Good people, according to this question, have a good nature, and evil people have an evil nature, and those two things aren't the same. So how, as bodhisattvas, do we encounter all beings as the same? Isn't it a mistake, this questioner says, for the bodhisattva to consider all of these beings to be the same? And the answer is, well, yes, that would be a mistake if there was such a thing as a fixed cow nature or a fixed evil nature. But for the bodhisattva, there's no distinction to be made between identity and difference, or difference and sameness. So there's a teaching about this. And then the text offers this verse: non-arisen, non-destroyed, unceasing, non-eternal, neither identical nor different, without coming or going, dharmas resulting from causes escape from all vain wordiness. The Buddha is able to define them. I pay homage to him. So conditioned things don't arise or perish. They're not permanent or impermanent. They're not different or the same. They don't come and go. So because they're empty, they can't be described accurately in words, but Buddha can see and understand what's happening here, right? So Buddha sees and understands all of this. So this verse says, I pay homage to him. The point is, conditioned things we encounter are empty. We've talked about here before, empty of all kind of fixed, permanent self-nature, and therefore they cannot come and go. So we can't put boundaries around them. We can't describe them in words, because there is no place where we can say this thing ends and another thing begins, right? We can't make distinctions in the largest possible perspective. So if things are not actually separate from each other, then how do we isolate one thing and say, well, now this one thing is arising, separate from, independent from all other things? We can't make that kind of distinction between one thing and another. How does one thing arise independently of anything else? So another early text, Prajnapadamita Shastra, shows how the bodhisattva accepts that even his or her body is non-arising, is non-existent. So that's pretty rough, right? I mean, we live in this body 24/7, so it's pretty difficult to step back and say, wait a minute, I'm going to give up my idea somehow that I am this body, or that this body doesn't arise. So if the body doesn't arise or cease, where does that leave us, right? That feels like annihilation. That feels like, what do you mean? I experience living in this body all the time. So if the body doesn't arise or cease, like, what's going on? Well, according to this text, when we accept the non-arising of this individual sort of personal body, then there is only the Dharmakaya. There is only the Dharma body of Buddha, which is the same as nirvana. So now we see where this gate statement is kind of pointing us, right? Within the Dharmakaya, there are no pairs. There are no opposites. There can't be one side without the other side, and yet we can't distinguish between the sides. right? We get to hold all of these things as true. So at what point does dark stop becoming dark and become light, right? At what point does youth stop being youth and become age? At what point does living become dying, right? It's like, where is the line? These things can't arise independently of each other, separately of each other. So the gay statement talks about accepting non-arising, but I think it's also implying then that we accept non-perishing, because these two things can't be separate, right? If we accept non-arising, we accept non-perishing. Accepting one part of the pair of opposites means accepting the other part as well. So if we accept birth or life or arising, then we also accept death. And that's very difficult for us, right? In this human form, that's tough to accept. So Uchiyama Roshi says, as long as we think we were born, we will die. Grasped by thoughts, people usually think only of living and put a lid on dying in order not to see it. They don't understand true life. When we uncover the lid and see that life includes death, we can see true life clearly. As the reality of life, we are born and die within the total interpenetrating self that has no birth and death. This is Maha, great boundless vastness. So in Japanese Buddhism, there is the term shoji, which perhaps you've run across. In fact, Dogen wrote an entire fascicle called Shoji, or Life and Death. There are several kinds of life and death. When we consider in this tradition, all the teachings about life and death and our experiences of life and death, there are various kinds of life and death. One is the process of being born and growing older and become sick and dying. This kind of life and death is an abbreviation for what Siddhartha Gautama encountered when he left the palace 4 times, right? And he encountered these various kinds of suffering, and his eyes were opened, there's suffering. There's dukkha. What is dukkha about? That's one kind of life and death. There's also life and death, which is seen as one long period of time between our birth and our death. Somehow, I was born in a particular year and I've lived a certain number of years, and, here's today, and at some point I will die. So that life, that period of time, we can think of as life and death. There is this life and death, which is this moment by moment birth and death, this body and mind being born and dying, or arising and perishing, moment by moment by moment by moment, is another way to think about life and death. There is also the day-to-day life of ordinary people, like us, who are pulled around. We're transmigrating through the 6 realms because we're pulled by our karma, right? We've had experiences in the past. We've done things in the past. We have karmic influences up to this point from beginningless beginning. And somehow we are living that out. That unfolding is sort of pulling us around. We're pulled around by our karma. Another kind of life and death is the life of the bodhisattva, who's led by vow. Rather than living by karma, the bodhisattva is living in this samsaric world to liberate beings, right? So this bodhisattva is not living life after life after life because of being pulled around by karma, but because of the vow to be in this samsaric world to liberate beings. So it's not a matter of being the victim of 3 poisonous mind, right? It's a matter of choosing to be here in order to liberate beings. So Dogen's teaching is that life and death in samsara is the same as the life of Buddha. It's not different from nirvana. So again, here's opposites that are, they're opposites, but they're not opposites. So here's our life in samsara being pulled around. And also, that living and dying and arising and perishing is not different from nirvana. So in Shobogenzo Zenki, he says, just understand that birth and death is itself nirvana. There is nothing such as birth and death to be avoided. There is nothing such as nirvana to be sought. Only when you realize this are you free from birth and death, right? So in order to understand this teaching on arising and perishing, we also have to understand Dogen's view of time. Well, Dogen's view of time is complicated. So it's a really complex topic, and I'm only going to just say a few things about it here today, but if you are interested in this, as some of you are, please dive into Shobogenzo Uji, being time. So in this discussion about Dogen's view of time, something arises, it seems to exist for some period of time, and then it perishes. But Dogen says that each thing exists in its Dharma position in this moment. So it has its own past and future, and yet each of these moments is independent. So it isn't that there is a linear time in which a thing appears and grows and changes moment. It's in its Dharma position. there's some continuation, which means that whatever this thing is in its dharma position functions as itself. In other words, a dog doesn't turn into a tree in the next moment. There's some continuation, but these moments are independent. So, if we're speaking about the dog who doesn't turn into the tree, the dharma position of puppy and adult dog and elderly dog are independent from each other, and the power of puppy is to negate puppy and become dog, and the power of adult dog is to negate adult dog and become elderly dog. And yet that puppy or dog is empty and has no fixed and permanent self. So these things seem to be contradicting each other. How can there be influence? How can there be continuation when we say the being is empty and past and future are sort of independent of this present moment and dharma position? So it's not so easy to understand, but this is how arising and perishing works in the world of Dogen. So we have karmic influences that somehow shape this moment, influence this moment, but this moment is new and fresh and independent. So the past is gone. We've heard Hojo-san say this how many times? Past is gone. We can't take action there. Future is not yet here. We can't take action there. All we really have is this eternal now, this present moment. So in Shobogenzo Shoji, Dogen says, it is a mistake to think that life turns into death. Life is a position at one time with its own before and after. Consequently, in the Buddha Dharma, it is said that life is itself no arising. Death is a position at one time with its own before and after. Consequently, it is said that death is itself no perishing. In life, there is nothing other than life. In death, there is nothing other than death. Therefore, when life comes, just live. When death comes, just die. Neither avoid them nor desire them. And right there is exactly what this gate statement is talking about. Realization of non-appearance is a gate of Dharma illumination, for with it, we experience the truth of cessation. So according to early Buddhist teachings, Buddha saw that the only way to cessation of suffering was the cessation of rebirth, right? The only way to leap off that wheel of suffering was somehow to leap off of this wheel of being reborn. And then the world of desire, our craving and aversion sort of intersect with impermanence to keep us stuck there, to keep us on this wheel, to keep us transmigrating through the six realms. But even if we manage to loosen those bonds and move to some other place in the six realms, that we might like better, somehow the very fact of our existence means that there is suffering. This is the first noble truth, right? As long as here we are in this human form and we've arisen somehow, we have suffering. That's the first noble truth. Life somehow, or arising somehow, brings suffering with it. So if beings don't arise, then somehow suffering ceases. We can see now how Dogen interpreted all of that, put his own kind of interpretation on that. Non-arising and cessation of suffering for him is not about leaping free from the wheel of samsara, going somewhere else, and it's not about not existing at all. It's about understanding that non-arising is the reality of our moment-by-moment experience, and in that way, nirvana, or cessation of suffering, is right here, in the midst of it all. So it's not about not being here. It's not about going somewhere else. It's about understanding non-arising. And in that moment, here we are in nirvana, which is already this day-to-day samsaric existence. It's not different or separate. So from a place of awakening, we can see that non-arising has already been accomplished right here, right? Non-arising is already right here. So because things are empty of a permanent fixed self nature, they don't arise as independent beings or dharmas or items or something that we can distinguish and put a label on and somehow draw a boundary around. So the dharma position has a before and after, but all those things are independent of each other. So something doesn't become something else because there is no, according to Dogen, no linear stream of time. Something doesn't turn into something else. There's only this moment. There's only this eternal now. When we see that, then we are released from clinging, the kind of clinging that causes our suffering, right? If we really see and understand non-arising, non-perishing, then we get to not be caught, right? The clinging that leads to our moment-by-moment suffering maybe loosens its grip on us a little bit. So again, in the Shishogi, Dogen says, the most important issue for all Buddhists is a thorough clarification of the meaning of birth and death. If the Buddha is within birth and death, there is no birth and death. Simply understand that birth and death are in themselves nirvana. There is no birth and death to be hated, nor nirvana to be desired. Then for the first time we will be freed from birth and death. To master this problem is of supreme importance. So if the Buddha is within birth and death, there is no birth and death. In other words, if we're seeing with Buddha's eyes, right, we're seeing with with the eyes of awakening, then there is no arising and there is no perishing in the broadest possible perspective. So clearly, this is a huge deal for Dogen if he says the most important issue for all Buddhists is a thorough clarification of the meaning of birth and death. Like, this is a central thing. He's pointing to this like with big flashing arrows and saying this is something we need to dive into and to investigate thoroughly. So he's not just saying we need to understand our individual life stories. When he's talking about we really need to get what birth and death is about, it's bigger than I simply need to understand my moment by moment sort of experience of my personal life in this body. He says we need to awaken to non-appearance and non-perishing of everything in the universe. So this is way bigger than me. I need to be able to look around me and really understand non-arising and non-perishing, throughout the entire network of interdependent origination. So we need to deeply get how this works, or we are always going to be subject to our suffering. So Dogen wrote a lot about this, excuse me, because it is a central teaching. He wrote about it particularly in the Genjo Koan, which is a very famous piece of his writing, and you may be familiar with that. It's the first fascicle of the 75 fascicle version of the Shobo Genzo. Hojo-san wrote a whole book about it. So maybe you have read his book about Genjo Koan. So Hojo-san says that the main theme of the entire Mahayana tradition is seeing one reality from two sides. We know he talks about this all the time, seeing one reality from two sides. He says also that the main theme of Dogen's Genjo Koan is how to live in practice based on clearly understanding one reality from two sides. So Genjo Koan is saying, how do we take that teaching and really live that? So it's an important teaching related to this whole arising, perishing, non-arising, non-perishing, birth and death. So Hojo-san explains the word Genjo from Genjo Koan. He says Gen means to appear or show up, or to be in the present moment. But it also has this feeling of something that was hidden and is now visible. So a manifestation of something potential into something actual is one way to put that. But the larger view is there is nothing actually hidden, right? There is nothing actually to be revealed because there's non-arising and non-perishing. So the Jo piece of Genjo, to complete or to accomplish. So Genjo is to manifest, to actualize, to appear, to become, right? Hojo-san says the term koan in this case is pointing to the intersection of difference and sameness. Now, he writes a lot about that, which I'm not going to go into, but for our purpose today, we can say what he's pointing to is koan's, it somehow is the intersection of difference and sameness. So this is all about two sides of one reality. This is all about seeing what appears or manifests in that intersection of difference and sameness, or unity and diversity. Like, what is arising, what is appearing, what is manifesting in that intersection, and then seeing how things like arising and perishing and life and death are and are not opposites, right? They don't negate each other and they do negate each other. So how do we stand up in the middle of that intersection, with all of these opposites that are and are not opposites, two sides of one reality? So Nishi Ariboku-san was a Dogen scholar in the late 1800s. And he says the gen spoken of here is not the gen that is related to hiding or appearing, remaining or perishing. There is neither hiding nor appearing in the true Genjo. When we say that a hidden thing appears, it usually refers to the appearance that is relative to hiding. In this dualistic sense, it is the phenomenon of birth and death. But actually, in the realm of true Genjo, there is no hiding. Thus, there is no appearing. What can be merely hidden or revealed is not the true Genjo. When we say there is no hiding or appearing, it means that there is no arising or perishing, no increasing or decreasing. The Dharma realm of heaven and earth, as it is, extends from the Kashyapa Buddha in the past to Maitreya Buddha in the future, unceasingly through the past, present, and future, regardless of the creation or the destruction of the world. So Dogen starts his Genjo Koan by setting up three important sets of opposites, or three pairs, in our practice in our tradition. One is delusion and enlightenment. The second one is Buddhas and living beings. And the third is life and death, or arising and perishing. So he sets these things up as pairs. And first he says, there is delusion and realization, practice, life and death, Buddhas and living beings. And then he says, There is no delusion and no realization, no Buddhism, no living beings, no birth, no perishing. And then finally he says, there is arising and perishing, delusion and realization, living beings and Buddhas. So he thinks it's pattern, kind of like the Heart Sutra, right? There's things, and then there's not things, and then there's things. So he sets up the opposites, says they exist, they don't exist, they exist, right? So first we perceive our lives in the usual way. Beings are born, things are created, they have some lifespan, and then they die or break or become obsolete, or something happens, right? Then when we practice, we see that actually there is nothing we can distinguish as an independent being or an independent thing, something that rises, separately from other things, something that's coming into existence or going out of existence kind of on its own. Finally, we understand that reality is in the intersection of these 2 points of view. So the actual appearing and disappearing is within the non-arising and non-perishing, right? This is not something we get with the intellect. So just like the Genjo Koan, the gate statement is about understanding 2 sides of one reality and practicing within that understanding, or practicing with that understanding. So there is our own birth and death. We all have a birthday. At some point, this body appeared, right? We're going to live a certain period of time. We know this. This is our moment by moment experience. At some point in the future, life comes to an end. There's our experience of things coming into our lives and things going out of our lives. Sometimes that's an object. We acquire it, we use it, it breaks or it changes form. Sometimes that's a relationship. We form a relationship with a person or a thing or an organization, and then something changes and that relationship fades, right? So we all have this experience. Things arising in our lives and going out of our lives in some way. That's real. Nobody's saying those things aren't real and true. They are. Also, there is nothing we can distinguish as arising or perishing or coming and going. At what point is there a boundary where something arrives and something is gone? So we're living and dying in the midst of this non-arising and non-perishing, and we get to hold both of these things. We get to hold both of these sides of reality. So I think Dogen understood that even though this teaching is one of the most important, most central teachings for us, it's really difficult for us to understand. I think he kept writing about it and kept pointing to it and coming at it with different examples and different stories, because this is like not easy stuff, right? I mean, I looked at this gate statement and went, oh dear, what am I going to say about this to help anybody get what's happening here? So we all are kind of thrashing around in the midst of this. So he talked about it over and over in various different ways, various different examples, and it keeps coming back somehow to interconnectedness and impermanence, right? Somehow these 2 things are really in the center of this whole teaching about non-arising, non-perishing. So in the Bendowa, he explains that interconnectedness and impermanence, for instance, are precisely why there is no soul or no Atman, right? And we know at the time, there was a certain amount of belief in some permanent, fixed spirit nature, something that went on beyond the body. And so he's saying, no. He says, if we accept that all things are impermanent, then how can we think that there is a permanent soul that goes on somewhere else once the body perishes or once life ends, right? If all things are impermanent, then how can we think that there's something that goes on? That sort of never perishes even once the body ceases to live. If we accept interconnectedness also, then how can we separate the mind from the body? How can we separate, a soul, a mind nature, a spirit nature from the body, right? So yes, mind and body exist in this moment. We have the experience of having a mind and a body, but they don't arise or cease. They certainly don't arise or cease as separate from each other. If we just look at the basic teachings, we say, well, that can't be. So he says, clinging to an idea about a permanent soul or a permanent spirit or Atman or some such thing doesn't free you from life and death. We'd like to cling to these things and say, oh, there's something that goes on beyond my immediate life. I can feel good about that. I'm now sort of freed from life and death because something goes on. He says, if we're clinging to that, not only have we not freed ourselves from life and death, we're creating life and death. We're creating the suffering that goes with that simply because we're clinging to this idea. So there are a number of other examples in the Eihei Koroku, for instance, where Dogen talks about arising and perishing. He comes back to it again and again. In one place he says, this very body and mind are not merely the 5 skandhas. Our wondrous existence is most excellent and should not be an object of desire. Without coming or going, we simply respond to sounds and colors. Further, we turn around from our center and move out in the 8 directions. Negating all dualities, our feet are on the ground. How could there be a rising and perishing as our magnanimous energy pierces the heavens? Although it is like this, do not say that killing Buddha after all has no results. The genuine cause of attaining Buddhahood is Zazen. Okay, there's a lot happening there. So let's look a bit more closely at that. This very body and mind are not merely the 5 skandhas. Our wondrous existence is most excellent and should not be an object of desire. So this very body and mind, I mean, he's being quite specific, this very body and mind, are body and mind as complete manifestations of reality. So this is beyond our limited view of what body and mind means for me, right? Anytime we encounter something that says this very something, we're talking about thusness. We're talking about the reality before we poke our heads in and have an idea about it. So this very body and mind, the reality of body and mind, right? Something which is completely manifesting. So he says we shouldn't be clinging to life as just something that belongs to this small self, right? Something we own for our own purposes, right? It's like, we're driving a car. So we shouldn't be clinging to life that way because there's something bigger happening. It's true that we have a body and mind and a sort of an impermanent life, and also there's a much bigger story happening here. So we need to not cling to our own perspective about this, right? Without coming or going, we simply respond to sounds and colors. So in the world of non-arising and non-perishing, we carry out our function in this Dharma position, if we want to put it that way. We do that with this body and mind, which includes the sense organs that we talked about last week, the sense gates that take in sense data, colors and sounds. And we take in those sense data. We do something with that. We write a story about it. We create something out of it. We have a perception. We take action, right? It starts the whole chain of that thing happening. So in the midst of this limited human form, sense organs are functioning. They're taking in stuff. Without coming and going, we carry out that function. We carry out our function as bodhisattvas in this Dharma position without getting stuck there, without getting pulled around by our karma, right? This is the life of the bodhisattva. So without coming and going, without getting stuck, we simply respond to our lives in a moment-by-moment way. We see clearly, we take skillful action, we liberate beings. Further, we turn around from our center and move out in the 8 directions. So we see and act from a broader perspective than just this limited body and mind, just what's going on for me. Negating all dualities, our feet are on the ground. How could there be a rising and perishing as our magnanimous energy pierces the heavens? So even though we have a body and mind that functions in this world of samsara and life and death, we also see beyond the opposites. I love this phrase, negating all dualities, our feet are on the ground. Right? So we have the concrete feeling of I'm standing, on the ground. I'm walking on the earth. I'm doing the things that I need to do. And yet in the midst of that, I also see through the dualities. I also understand that there's nothing separate. What a great description of our sort of moment-by-moment bodhisattva life. There's something about that phrase I just think is really, really interesting. So even though here we are physically functioning in this world of samsara, we also see through the opposites, right? To carry out our function, we need to make distinctions. We need to know that's a red light, that's a green light. We need to, be able to pick and choose. This is a healthy thing. This is an unwholesome thing, right? So we need to make distinctions. And yet we need to see that beyond that, there's no distinction to be made. So in this way, we live and die in nirvana as bodhisattvas, and we can work to liberate all beings right in the midst of this samsaric world. Although it is like this, do not say that killing Buddha, after all, has no results. The genuine cause of attaining Buddhahood is Zazen. So this whole killing Buddha thing, you might have encountered this in other texts, this idea about killing Buddha. In this case, killing Buddha means going beyond our stories, our limited ideas about what awakening is, right? We can't describe awakening, really, in an accurate way. We can't get our heads around awakening because of our limited views and because words are limited. We can't possibly completely describe awakening. So, killing Buddha means we go beyond what we think awakening is, right? Buddha and awakening in this case being the same. We can somehow put aside our thoughts, our ideas, our stories about awakening, and actually be right in the middle of awakening, which we already are, but, we kind of forget that. So killing Buddha, We sort of put our idea about Buddha over here, and we actually stand up straight in the midst of this very moment of awakening. So this is, of course, what we do in Zazen, right? This is a description of what we're doing in Zazen. So even though awakening is already here, even though we're not practicing in order to get something or to cultivate something or something, awakening is already right here. Even though we're already beyond arising and perishing and non-arising and non-perishing, we practice in order to manifest that in the world. We're not getting something that's not already here, but it's so difficult to live from that place because we have ideas about what Buddha is and what awakening is. So as Dogen frequently reminds us, practice and awakening are not two. So the awakening is here, but we practice because that's how we manifest awakening. Just like so many dualities that show up in this tradition and in this practice, so many dualities that get negated and upheld at the same time. This is what we're doing in Zazen. So to go back and just read that entire passage again, now that we've sort of taken it apart. This very body and mind are not merely the five skandhas. Our wondrous existence is most excellent and should not be an object of desire. Without coming or going, we simply respond to sounds and colors. Further, we turn around from our center and move out in the 8 directions. Negating all dualities, our feet are on the ground. How could there be arising and perishing as our magnanimous energy pierces the heavens? Although it is like this, do not say that killing Buddha, after all, has no results. The genuine cause of attaining Buddhahood is Zazen. So, what would you like to say about arising and perishing and life and death and whether those things actually exist? There's plenty to chew on here, so I want to leave time for whatever you'd like to say. And make sure you unmute so we can hear you.
What text did that come from? Could you say that again?
The last one, it's from the Eihei Kodoku, and I did not write down the number of that exchange, but I can get it to you if you want. Yeah, I don't think I wrote it down.
That's fine.
I can tell you the page number. It's 271. I do tend to try to write it down here, so in case somebody asks me, I have it. It's page 271. I think it's a great exchange, and as I say, there are several others about arising and perishing in the Eihei Kodoku, and some of them are a bit impenetrable to me. So I wanted to work with one today that felt like we could sort of get our teeth into it a little bit. I love the Eihei Kodoku, but sometimes it's impenetrable. What would folks like to say? Myogen, please.
Yeah, for those of you who don't know, I think Hoko is referring to me for one of those people who are fascinated by time. One of the things I sit with, which is actually kind of interesting, and I never really put this together until now, is consciousness. That is a really good example of no arising, no perishing. We focus on this idea of self, idea of a soul, and when we do that, we do get lost in the distinctions, which is kind of fun, right? But when you think of consciousness, your consciousness, me, who I am, the identity of it neither arises nor perishes. It's been there, it's there. I think of myself as a 20-year-old, a 13, 80, et cetera, within, we have all these effects of age as we age, but at no point in time, no pun intended, is our consciousness, there's no arising, no perishing in consciousness. It is something that has been there since the beginning was beginning. And it gets kind of even interesting when you start thinking about dreams. Your consciousness doesn't go away. You're there, you're still there in a different form. Mine last night, we were discovering that you had to be a Doan in a brand new Buddhist group. I don't know why. We never thought of actually keeping time. This is interesting. And it even gets interesting when you start thinking about consciousness, when you, for example, when you have a surgery and you get put under, there's nothing there, but there is something there. So I don't know. I'm not really making a statement as much. Yeah, I'm just making a general observation that, that there is something we can look at in our day-to-day life that we have that is neither arising nor perishing. And it's, and we function with that on a daily basis.
Well, you're sharing what you're practicing with, which is fine. We don't need to have conclusions. There are a lot of things about which we will never come to conclusion, right? But it's interesting to sort of think about and hear about what people are practicing with. I think there are lots of, depending on sort of our karmic circumstances, I think we don't have to go very far in our own lives to find some example of where we are standing in the intersection of all of these things, right? We're doing, one reality from two sides. So, I think we don't have to look too far to find some pair of opposites or pair of things which we are working with or are keep coming up for us or something that give us the opportunity to work with this gate and say, okay, I see two things, and then can I also see not two things? Can I see arising and also non-arising, right? It feels, when we talk about it this way, it feels like something just like really abstract. It's like, how many bodhisattvas are on the head of the pin? It's like, do I care? Does this matter to me? But then when we really look at it deeply, we say, this is my moment by moment life. It's abstract, yeah, but it's also really concrete. With our feet on the ground, we're negating duality. So, like, how do we live in that intersection? It's a really interesting thing, and it's central to our practice. Until I came across, this writing from Hojo-san where he says, here is what Mahayana is all about. It's about one reality from two sides. And here's this Genjo koan which tells us how to do that. I thought, well, that's really interesting. Because I tend to like to know, like, what's the big idea? What's the overall theme of something? It's like, oh, now I have some perspective to read all the other things Dogen wrote and to, look at our practice kind of broadly. It's like, oh, the thing that keeps coming back is one reality, two sides, and connected with that is, interdependence and emptiness and interconnection and impermanence, and it's all kind of functioning together. Right? And there's so many ways to look at that and to practice with that, but it sort of keeps coming back to this thing. It's like, how do we investigate that? And there's at least 108 gates, right? Ways to look at this thing. And it just, that's what it keeps coming back to. What would other people like to say? Either what you're practicing with or just sort of what's coming up for you.
This reminded me of when I used to practice at the Missouri Zen Center in St. Louis, in the bathroom, they had like all the different little verses from from Eihei Shingi that you're supposed to say, like when you go to the bathroom or wash your hands or whatever. And then for some reason they had this other one from the Dhammapada, which is the mindfulness is the path to the deathless, heedlessness is the path to death, the mindful never die. The heedless are as if dead already. So the talk sort of reminded me of this because, if you have this idea of non-arising, there is, no, I mean, you only sort of experience death, I guess, insofar as you're clinging to your own body. But of course it can, I think the other thing that I wanted to say about it too is that it seems like in the Mahayana tradition, there's like always this tension between wanting to say that emptiness is somehow its own permanence, which is kind of a problem, and some texts seem to go a little too far in that direction. So I think we always need to be careful with statements like this, non-arising and non-perishing, because it gives this idea that, we're going to somehow literally like be immortal, which is of course not what it means. It means basically the opposite, that we have to fully accept the fact that we're completely mortal, and then through that process, we've reached some kind of radical acceptance. So
absolutely. Well, and so two interesting things you brought up. I love the whole thing with the gathas. What a great example of living in the intersection. Reality, one reality, two sides. Like, we're doing something simple. We're brushing our teeth, we're washing our hands, we're using the toilet. I mean, there's gathas for everything, head shaving, right, everything. Those things are really good example of, I'm doing this concrete thing, and then there's this bigger perspective. So I'm really glad you brought that up. I love those little gathas because it really, um, it makes you kind of step back and say, yeah, I'm doing this, kind of obvious day-to-day thing. And this is practice. And practice and realization are not two. So the fact that I'm washing my hands or the fact that I'm shaving my head or whatever it is I'm doing, right, is practice in a much larger sense. So I love that. Thank you for bringing that up. I wish I'd thought of that to talk about it. Yeah, this whole thing about clinging to emptiness, boy, that's its own sickness, isn't it? Because as soon as we have an idea about emptiness, we want to equate it with things like the soul, or we want to start thinking, well, like everything is arising from emptiness, as though emptiness was a ground. Emptiness was a place where things sort of get manufactured and then they appear. So we really can get stuck with clinging to emptiness as a fixed permanent thing, which is, of course, the exact opposite, as Doju says. It's the complete opposite of what's really going on. Emptiness is completely dynamic. There is no piece of emptiness we can grab onto and say, here it is, because it's just emptiness is changing all the time too, right? It's empty. It's got no fixed anything. So it's just this constant movement. It's this constant dynamic movement. So I think in our limited human efforts to, grab onto a teaching, it is easy to grab onto emptiness as a thing. And we can't. We're like constantly letting go of our ideas about emptiness, because any idea I have about emptiness can't be right. And yet we have to talk about emptiness in order to talk about our teachings and talk about our practice together and all of that. So that's a pitfall. It's a real pitfall. You're absolutely right. What would others like to say?
I've been practicing, I think, as a lot of people have these days, a lot about race and racism. And I think, race itself is a good example of arising and not arising. We talk about it as a social construct. It doesn't exist, and yet it exists. It has clear and present implications for a lot of people, for all of us. So one of the things you hear a lot these days in talking about racism is Faulkner's quote, "The past isn't gone, the past isn't even the past." And so I got to wondering that, we know collective karma influences us deeply. It becomes a part of who we are, and we act it out, whether we know it or not. So I'm wondering, how does that fit in with Dogen's concept of being time? If I can't even express. It seems like those things may be contradictory, but they're probably not. The past does influence us right now in a big way, but it doesn't exist.
Well, so yeah, I'm not surprised you're having trouble articulating the question, because being time is not easy. I'll just say, being time is not easy. People have written whole books about being time. Dogen can recommend a few. So it's true that the past has some influence, right? Because the way things unfold, there's some karmic influence over what this moment is like. And yet, Dogen would say past and future are cut off. We can't act in the past. We can't change the past. We can't touch the past. We can't go back there, whatever we think that is, right? Eternal now is what we've got. So there's influence on the eternal now, and what we're doing in this eternal now, probably sets some causes and conditions for how things will continue to unfold. But Dogen would say, here's the Dharma position, right? In this moment, here's the Dharma position. There's some continuity, but but this moment is independent. So it's not something that always intellectually makes sense, but I'll tell you what I take from that, which is encouraging. It means, yes, there's some karmic conditioning which influences this moment, but because past and future are cut off, or because because this is a fresh moment, I have some opportunity to take a skillful action, to do a wholesome thing, to shift something which needs to be shifted, to bring some wholesomeness into the world, and not feel that I'm dragging this past with me. That doesn't mean I ignore it. It doesn't mean I suppress it. It doesn't mean I think it's okay. I love it. Paradoxical is contradictory. It doesn't mean that I condone necessarily harmful actions in the past. I recognize them. I accept that suffering. We know as bodhisattvas, we've talked a lot here about accepting the suffering. So if this is a fresh new moment, what do I do now? How do I see this moment clearly now? How do I take a good action right now that benefits beings? Not ignoring this, but I don't have to be constrained by it necessarily if I'm seeing clearly, because this moment contains all the other moments, right? Time and space, here's the intersection. It's in this eternal now. So there have certainly been countless harmful actions in the past. We say that when we do our vow and repentance, and this is why vow and repentance are important, right? The two practices for us, vow and repentance. Countless harmful things happened in the past. We created some unwholesome karma, So in this moment, when we repent, and we're not saying, oh, I'm a terrible person, we're saying I acknowledge there were harmful karmic actions in the past. Now, in this moment, I vow to be the best bodhisattva I can be. In this moment, I vow to see clearly, act skillfully, do the work I need to do, sit zazen, right? So I think there's kind of some encouragement there. In the beginning, it feels scary. What do you mean past and future are cut off? It feels like we're out here without a lifeline. Man, we're floating around somewhere. But I kind of look at that differently and say, well, I think that means we're not stuck. In the midst of emptiness, we're not stuck. So I don't know if that helps you, and I encourage you to dig into Shobogenzo Uji if you want to. It's really interesting. It's just not something you cover in 40 minutes or 50 minutes. It's like I had to bring it up today because it's part of this conversation, but I hope that this is a gateway for others to kind of continue to investigate. I mean, life and death. How do we get away from life and death? This is our whole practice. There's nowhere else to go, right? What would others like to say? Reflections, questions, things to bring up? Iris is waving at me.
Hi.
Hi.
I am curious. I'm not quite sure. I would like to know more. I'm not quite sure with the last question, I think there wasn't like a specific question. I think I got quite lost though, because which, that sounds like a judgment. I think that you were saying like there's so much to talk about, whatever. But I'm just curious because I would like to know more because and I'm sure I didn't understand the first question. Like that's probably like a given. Because when I think of this, I think of like it kind of, and I'm going to say this all jumbled, but, I feel like there is, there's time, sure, because race doesn't exist, but it was created, like, I don't know the words for it, but at a period of time, and it was like organized and like, now this is a thing, and didn't make it real, but of course the effects of it are real all the time. There is no time now that there are not effects of that. And I think also because it's not real, I think this is an interesting intersection because it's not real and because we're kind of not supposed to talk about it, then we also try to push out of the conversation people's actual lived experiences about it. And so, but it's here all the time, And so I guess that's where I'm getting a little, but I'm not trying to argue with anything. Like I'm not sure what I'm adding, but I think that I'm not sure. That's what I'm putting into that.
Yeah, well, so non-arising doesn't mean things aren't real. It's not a commentary on the nature of well, it is, but in a way, it's not a commentary on the reality of the thing. It's about how does that thing come to be or not. So to say something doesn't arise is not to say it isn't real. So in a way, we can say our ideas of whatever, or the things that sort of we've created, we can say that our concept or our experience is something arises, and in the broader perspective, it doesn't arise because it was never not there, and it will never not be there. So the arising is the issue, not the reality of whatever that the Dharma is. I'm going to use Dharma as a conditioned thing, right? So non-arising is not disputing the reality of the conditioned thing. It's saying, how did it come to be or not? So if we say, well, racism, for instance, to take it as an example, and we could use any example there is, this is the one that's arising today. If we say, yes, it's a social construct, we have a lot of ideas about it. We've written stories about it for several hundred years or more. We've created a thing. We're not saying that doesn't exist, but can we actually find a beginning point? I mean, karmic conditions are such that something influenced. So if we say, there's a person who created an idea, there's some karmic conditions that influence the person creating the idea. Where did that start? It's the beginningless beginning. We can't ever say that those things, we can't say those things are not part of this eternal now, because where's the beginning and where's the end? So now we're coming back to, we can't make distinctions between things that have arisen, because nothing arises independently, right? Because of interdependence, things lead to things. Things appear in the world because they are influenced by other things. So any set of ideas, any set of social constructs, we can say, where's the beginning of that? In that way, there's non-arising. It doesn't mean they're not real. It doesn't mean they're not painful. It doesn't mean they don't have, effects. It doesn't mean that we shouldn't be talking about it. Where does it actually start? And if we're looking to untangle unwholesomeness in this world, and if we feel that as bodhisattvas, we are called to change the system, or at least to investigate the system, where does that start and where does it end? It's a huge undertaking. If we're really going to investigate clearly something like racism, well, there are people, we have one in the room, who spent an entire career working on this. So it's where is the end? So when we're talking about non-arising, I don't want anyone to think it means that I'm saying these things aren't real, right? That people aren't affected by them. That wouldn't be seeing, reality. That wouldn't be seeing with Buddha's eye. We would say, well, what do you mean there's no suffering? Of course there's suffering around this stuff. Where does it begin and where does it end? It's got tentacles. And we all know, several of us, several folks here have begun to sort of investigate this. It's where there's pieces of it that we don't even see yet. We're not even clear about, that, things that are happening that we're taking for granted, or that we don't think that there's ever been a different way to do things, right? So that's what this teaching is pointing to. And Iris, I don't know if that helps you. But I do want to be clear, I'm not negating suffering here. There is suffering. If there's life and death, golly, there's suffering. But I think the challenge for us as bodhisattvas is, where does that end? In the beginningless beginning and in the endless end, what do I do in this moment? I think that's a lifelong practice challenge. Do you want to follow up on anything there? And I see you, Doju.
No, that's very helpful. I appreciate that. And, you talking, and of course, comes from, I think, the Three Poisonous Minds, which is that's beginningless. So thanks.
Yeah, exactly. Well, when we look at, we looked at that whole sense organ thing last week. It's where does it start? Three Poisonous Minds. Well, where's the beginning of that? Doju, you wanted to leap in.
Yeah, I'm not sure that it is completely relevant to the issue of racism, but I think it's a good point to point out that the original wording of the phrase that you mentioned, the last part of that is kshanti in Sanskrit, which means patience or forbearance. Yeah. So the idea is not really recognition of non-arising, but patience with this fact of non-arising. And the idea in the context of Mahayana Buddhism was, as a bodhisattva, you're supposed to stay in the world of samsara for lifetime after lifetime to help all beings. And so to have the patience to do that, we need to recognize emptiness, basically, is what this is this gate, I think, is sort of telling us. And I think with any kind of social work that we might aim to do, of course, we need great patience. And in the Mahayana context, this is multi-generational task, lifetime after lifetime. It's not something that we can, hope to achieve, in the next, in a 5-year plan or something. So I think that this idea of patience is really important.
Yeah, thank you for that. And I didn't talk about the particulars of Sanskrit, so I'm glad you brought that up. Yeah, patience. It really brings an interesting perspective to this gate, doesn't it? It's not even, as you say, it's not even simply being aware of non-arising. It's like, how do we sit with that, work with that, live with that, use that in our bodhisattva work? How do we hang in there in this samsaric realm? Because as bodhisattvas, technically we have the opportunity to go to the other shore and leave it all behind. And we've said, no, our vow is to have patience with this, to hang around and to liberate beings. Thank you for that wrinkle. That's important.
That I'm not sure this is correct, but I think that several months ago, maybe in a Wednesday group, Sagan, you pointed out that the word patience comes from suffering.
Oh, interesting. Sagan, can you remind us what you said? Do you remember what you said?
Well, I was just looking at the root of the verb. In Latin, patior means I suffer, and patient, the adjective form patient means suffering. It's the process. It's the ongoing experience, suffering. A person who is patient is one who is suffering. Suffering maybe in the sense of undergoing things, huh? Or coping with adversity.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah,
So
ignore the connections.
yeah, I'm glad you remembered that. I had forgotten that. I'm glad you remembered that. Yeah, and so then of course we get to practice with the potential pitfall of saying, I am a long-suffering and patient bodhisattva. Am I not a wonderful human being? Right? It's like, how do we have patience, endurance, forbearance with suffering in a way which is not about my personal ego? And that's not easy. How do I look around me and recognize non-arising and then not sort of build my ego around that? Oh, I see non-arising. I am a wonderful bodhisattva. So, right? We have to hold that loosely. Things that others like to say. Hoshin.
Yeah, I just want to kind of add to that conversation. I was listening to an Irish poet, an interview with an Irish poet recently, and he said something that just kind of grabbed a hold of me, and that is impatience is a perverted relationship with time.
Ooh.
And I've kind of been rolling that around. I think about how often we try to make things unfold so that we have a kind of grasp on them. But at the times when we're more or less out of dukkha into sukha, into the flow of our lives, things are permitted to unfold on their own. And that's just my 2 cents.
I love that. Impatience is a perverted relationship with time. Well, it really points to our expectations and our ideas and our clinging, right? If I'm impatient, I want things to be other than they are. And we've said many times, there, right there is the basis for suffering. I want things to be different than they are. Well, that's clinging. Thank you for that. That's really interesting. That's really good. Other things this morning, Sagan?
Yeah, I very much appreciated that remark. I think that's very insightful. I was curious though, Ado put a message about the 2 terms contradictory and paradoxical. I wonder if she wanted to say a little bit more about that. I hadn't really heard that particular distinction or that kind of differentiation.
Yeah, Ado, let's hear from you.
Hi, I'm Ado, and this is Buffy. We're in Minneapolis. I was responding to something someone said about things seeming contradictory. And I was thinking all the things we're talking about, they all sound like they could be, you could say contradictory, but to me, paradoxical is more appropriate and has a different really meaning. Is because paradoxical doesn't mean that they're really opposed. It just means that both sides are true. And I think that's kind of the gist of this whole discussion in a way, that both sides are true, which is paradoxical, but not contradictory.
I like that. I think that's really helpful. Yeah, Sagan, thank you for pointing us back to that because we didn't get a chance to talk about it. I think it's absolutely true. I mean, when you think about paradoxical, I can hold two sides of a paradox.
Right.
Even though they seem to be like, conflicted, if we can hold two sides, I think that sort of, paradoxical versus contradictory is a useful distinction. Sagan wanted to say something else.
Yeah, it almost sounds like it's kind of referring to the notion of sandokai, the reconciliation or harmony of opposites. So paradox is sort of the acceptance of those two things together.
Yeah.
Right. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, it's Sandokai in a nutshell. Merging of difference and sameness, or merging of identity and diversity. Yeah, absolutely. Really helpful.
So I just like to add something. When we think of something as contradictory, it's kind of a problem that we are trying to, we want to solve, but we can't. Well, if something is paradoxical, there's nothing to solve. It's just what it is.
Yeah, exactly. That's helpful too, isn't it? Because we look at two things like opposed and we say, well, I have to choose one, or one has to win, or
Right.
we have to negate one somehow. And if we say, well, it's not that it's a conflict, it's that it's a paradox,
Right.
then we absolutely have one reality from two sides. So I think if in our own practice, when we run into something, we say this seems to be a conflict, how can we make it instead? How can we see it instead as a paradox and hold both sides? Did I see a hand go up or somebody waving? I think somebody wanted to jump in.
I think Jeff had to leave and
Jeff
was
had to go.
waving goodbye.
Okay. Understood. Okay. Thank you for that. Very helpful. Other things this morning? Really interesting conversation. Brian, please.
Just something that popped into my head in the midst of this. This is a rather light observation, perhaps, but when we talk about paradoxical things, for example, this this does exist. No, it doesn't exist. Oh, but yes, it does exist. What I thought of was when you teach a child how to cross a street, you teach the child to first look to the left, and then look to the right, and then look to the left again. And then when it's safe, you cross the street. So I rather like all this, it is and it isn't, and kind of enjoy that. But what occurred to me is that you can look back and forth as many times as you want, but at some point you should cross the street. That's just an observation.
Yeah, well, that's true because, of course, in the end, what it comes down to is, as bodhisattvas, what are we doing? It's easy to say, well, I'm going to study this thing as a philosophy, or all these mental gymnastics about Dogen and the wacky stuff that he writes, that's a fun thing to do on the weekend. But then, what happens when Monday morning comes? What are we doing out there? At some point, we cross the street. Right? So, we know practice and realization, not two things. When folks arrive at this practice and they first take it up, I think they really don't expect it to be as practical as it is. And yet, push comes to shove and we go out in the world. And if we're not taking our practice out there with us, what are we doing? Right? So yeah, at some point we cross the street. And if we're not skillful about crossing the street, then we get to accept the outcome of that and do whatever we need to do. So we're going to make our best effort to take a skillful action. We're going to look both ways a couple times. We're going to try to do the thing that's wholesome. And yet we know once we step off the curb, we have no idea what's going to happen. And then we get to accept the consequences of that. I think it's a nice illustration. Thank you. Other things folks would like to say this morning? Everyone's had enough life and death for one day. I'm sure these themes will come back around because, as I say, they are really central. They're central to Dogen, they're central to Mahayana. And even today, we've touched on a number of things that we've said before. Okay, everyone good for this morning? All right. So I'll pitch back to Hoshin. We can do our closing chant and some announcements for today. Thank you for a really interesting discussion. I learned a lot from you.